Thank you, Janet. And thank you for the opportunity for allowing me to come and learn from you today and to share some of the things I've learned over the past 20-some odd years studying the nutrient creatine. Today's presentation, I'm going to start off much like Stu Phillips in a discussion. He eloquently referred to it as signal to noise. I'm just going to straight up call it bro science. So we'll start there. A little bit of a history lesson with the nutrient creatine, some of the fundamentals about creatine metabolism, and then on to creatine supplementation, what we know about how it affects human performance, how I think it can affect adaptation to exercise, and then a little bit on the effects of creatine supplementation in patient populations. So I think we should begin here with the definition. The predominant brand of reasoning in bodybuilding circles where the anecdotal reports of jack dudes are considered more credible than scientific research. Nutrition is difficult enough, and exercise science is difficult enough without all of the noise that comes from social media and the internet. Creatine in particular seems to be plagued by misinformation, and I'm not sure if Dr. Phillips agrees, but I would argue that in terms of sheer volume of bro science, the creatine, monohydrate, and protein are probably tied for misinformation. Now, I don't want you to just think that this misinformation comes from jacked guys at the gym. The so-called bro science comes from a variety of different sources, and a lot of it comes from the media. You know, deaths raise suspicions, 2 groups to look into creatine. Why? That wasn't even mentioned in the original medical report. An unfortunate case of a fatality that has to do with sickle cell trait. What's the news story say? And he drank a creatine-based shake before his practice. This is from a very prestigious medical journal. The title of this investigation would have been more accurately entitled, "An individual with pre-existing kidney disease taking an unbelievably nephrotoxic drug and some creatine had their kidney condition worsen." Now, we're going to revisit the effects of creatine on muscle dysfunction later on, but some of you are aware that there were 2 major, what we would call outbreaks of exercise-induced rhabdomyolysis in athletes not too long ago. One of them involved a very good collegiate football team where 13 players developed what they're calling this mysterious muscle malady, when it was really what we all know as exercise-induced rhabdomyolysis. Now, this was presented in the media as a giant mystery, and we were besieged with comments like this one that I found online. Let's see. Whoop. "I am a medical professional, physician, and not retarded. Creatine supplements, which about 90% of these kids take, hold water in the muscle tissue, decreasing vascular circulation and excretion of creatinine and lactic acid. And after a cardio and weightlifting exercise, this is rare for these kids, as well as for the levels of creatinine kinase to become this high and noticeably..." What? You know, this is part my fault, because if I was paying close attention, I would have realized that this person's username was pimpslapped1. Now, it's difficult, and these high school football players, again, presented as a very weird outbreak of some astonishingly new muscle illness, exercise-induced rhabdomyolysis. In these young men, they had such severe compartment syndrome in their triceps that some of them actually needed fasciotomies to release the pressure in their tricep, which is an unbelievably loose space and very difficult to cause that much swelling. What was the mysterious cause of the mysterious disease? Is creatine the culprit? These types of posts online represent an extraordinary amount of misinformation. Experts are divided. What is the root cause? No, experts aren't divided at all. It was exercise-induced rhabdomyolysis. Look at this. The boys are adamant that they're not taking creatine. It almost has to be another source. The school district is testing everything in sight. Water hoses? The gym? What? Help us, we need an expert. I know, let's ask the superintendent for a comment on nutrition and exercise physiology. She didn't believe the problems were caused by the type of workout. A representative from the medical center said, the players are being tested for creatine. What? What are you going to test them for next? Oxygen? ATP? The superintendent said, we believe it was a strenuous workout, but it wasn't excessive. The parents agreed, don't blame the football coach. There's no one at fault here. Now I'm going to ask you guys, let's have a look at the workout. Alternating push-ups and chair dips. 30 seconds of dips, 30 seconds of push-ups, immediately followed by 20 seconds and 20 seconds and 10 seconds and 7 seconds and 5 seconds with no rest. And then if you fail, the whole team gets punished and starts again. In immersion camp, when everyone's showing up deconditioned, this counts as an unaccustomed exercise in a hot room with no air conditioning and no one's drinking water. Does that sound like exercise-induced rhabdomyolysis to anyone but me? I'm going to make a judgment call and say creatine supplements had very little to do with this. So there you go. Thanks a lot, Professor. Now, one thing that's fascinating about creatine is that it is so very well researched. Creatine monohydrate was discovered in 1832 by a tremendous scientist named Michel Eugene Chevreul. And Chevreul was one of the most brilliant scientists, an expert in lipids. This is actually the original citation. I was taught at the University of Massachusetts that you should never use a secondary reference, and you always have to go back and find the original article. So there you go. If you want to help Chevreul's citation index, you can now reference the paper from 1832, which I think says something about the discovery of novel substance in de boeuf, which is probably beef. Now, my favorite thing about Chevreul is the hair. Bring me back in 10 years, and I'll try and get there. Now, some interesting observations from the mid to late 1800s of creatine show you how long it takes to really get to some of the answers in science. You read that top bulleted point, muscle creatine increases with exercise, and you think, isn't that the opposite of what we were all taught in exercise physiology and nutrition? Of course it is. Muscle creatine doesn't increase with exercise, it doesn't increase with fatigue, but this was a reproducible finding in the late 1800s. Now, it makes a lot more sense that muscle creatine might increase during exercise and fatigue if you haven't discovered ATP and phosphocreatine yet. So the first landmark was the discovery of creatine. The second landmark using animal research was that creatine is involved with exercise metabolism. But then there was a leap forward with the discovery of the CK reaction, the discovery of phosphorylcreatine and ATP, and now we have the well-described reaction that everyone sees in their biochemistry and nutrition and exercise physiology textbooks, that phosphocreatine readily donates its phosphate to ADP during times of energy need, and we rephosphorylate ATP and release free creatine. Phosphorylcreatine decreases, free creatine increases. The research continued, dozens and dozens and dozens of publications, but because of our technological limitations, we couldn't really connect this to exercise in humans until the early 1960s, when Jonas Bergstrom and Eric Hultman pioneered the muscle biopsy technique. This really was the point in time where we could examine the effects of exercise on all of the fuels, phosphorylcreatine, glycogen, and on from there. Nonetheless, creatine is one of the most heavily researched compounds of all time. If you go back to this book published in 1928, how many of you have a copy of an entire creatine textbook published in 1928? Okay. There's over 500 references in this book. There's absolutely no bro science whatsoever. There are hundreds and hundreds of articles on the nutrient creatine, creatine metabolism, and even on creatine supplementation itself. It really is one of the most researched nutritional aids available. Now, a bit about creatine metabolism. This is a non-essential nutrient. It's synthesized in our body from amino acids at a rate of about 1 gram per day. You also consume it in your diet. Now, quite often you see that dietary sources of creatine are so many grams per kilogram of meat. I don't actually measure my meat intake in kilograms, so I've included this graph from Mark Tarnopolsky. Oops. There we go. Because I think it's possible that you could eat an 8-ounce steak, which would get you about 2 grams of creatine, an 8-ounce piece of salmon, about 2 grams of creatine. Something like milk has very little creatine. It's basically confined to meats, highest in herring and lowest in chicken, which is about half of what we would get in meat. So we make 1 gram per day, we eat 1 gram per day, and then normal creatine turnover is about 2 grams per day. If you don't eat any meat, if you are on a low or no creatine diet, you'll be all right. You'll have less creatine in your muscles, you'll have less creatine in your blood, but that doesn't indicate any sort of dysfunction. You just have a little less creatine in your body. In fact, if I wanted to induce low levels of muscle creatine, I could put you on a vegetarian diet for as little as 3 weeks and you would have a remarkable drop in your muscle creatine. Now, if you have a genetic disease that has to do with the creatine transporter or any of the machinery, the mechanics that are involved in creatine uptake, and you had depleted your body's creatine levels, you would be a very sick person. The only way to help that person, and we can't help all of them, is with creatine supplementation, creatine replacement. These are rare genetic disorders, so for most of us, whether we eat meat or not, we're just fine. We just have different amounts of creatine in our muscles. And this is the interplay of 3 nutrients here. The top 2, creatine and phosphocreatine, they get most of the coverage because that's our backup system for ATP production during high-intensity exercise. We know that creatine and phosphocreatine are higher than type 2 fibers. I do not believe you can manipulate this system with exercise training. I know that some of your textbooks say muscle creatine increases with sprint type training. I disagree, and I have been unable to find a research study that supports this. I think the only way to manipulate it is to stop eating meat or to start using creatine supplements, but I don't think exercise has any effect. Now, creatine and phosphocreatine, about 95% of the creatine and phosphocreatine in your body are stored in your skeletal muscles. They're non-enzymatically broken down to creatinine, and creatinine is exported and filtered by the kidneys and excreted in the urine. We use creatinine levels as an indirect marker of kidney function. There is no creatinine kinase, there is no creatinine supplementation, I hope, and it's really just a breakdown product. So the interesting metabolites here are creatine and phosphocreatine. Now, when did creatine supplementation begin? From a nutritional perspective, quite a long time ago. The famous wrestler, 6th century BC, Milo of Croton, was rumored to have eaten 20 pounds of meat per day. They didn't really know much about sport nutrition then, but they equated things like eating muscle gives you more muscle. They also equated things like eating a heart would give you more heart, and eating testicles would give you God knows what, but the strength power athletes of long ago ate a lot of meat, and they ate enough meat to actually increase their muscle creatine levels. I do not recommend at this time that people eat 20 pounds of red meat per day, but it's actually remotely possible to increase your muscle creatine levels if you eat that much. In terms of a supplement, Justus von Liebig, one of the pioneers of chemistry, marketed a creatine supplement back in the 1800s. This was an extract of meat supplement. I can't really say I understand the concept here. In a time when most people couldn't afford meat, that they processed meat and turned it into a supplement that was probably rather high in creatine, but must have been much more expensive than actually buying meat. Nonetheless, this brown, ominous-looking substance was a popular supplement back in the 1800s to increase energy and vigor. Now, the real first modern supplementation study was published, if you can believe it, back in 1926 from Alfred Chanutin with assistance from Lauren Guy. Typical study from the 1920s, two guys sitting in a lab, and they decide, you know, we should eat this and see what happens. So they fed each other creatine, and they kept meticulous records of creatine intake and creatine excretion, and they found that they did not recover all of the creatine that they ingested. It means it stayed in the body somewhere, somehow. They also gained quite a bit of body weight in this study. The muscle biopsy technique helped us out a lot, and before we were actively studying creatine with the muscle biopsy technique, the news broke that Olympic gold medal winners were using creatine supplements to enhance their exercise performance, early 1990s. Truthfully, early 1980s and possibly even late 1970s, certain sports scientists who had a tight relationship with elite athletes were using creatine supplementation. It just wasn't making it into the media or into the scientific literature. In my world, the real big bang of creatine supplementation research was Roger Harris's original publication that showed everything we needed to know. If you ingest creatine orally, and we take muscle biopsies, your muscle creatine levels will increase approximately 20%. For those of you who don't know what this is an image of, there was a time when we went into the library and photocopied articles and actually wrote on them. That was pre-PDF. Okay, so let's get to the more modern stuff here. Creatine supplementation, let's talk about dosing, let's talk about its benefits as a training aid, and let's talk about its benefits as a performance enhancer. Notice monohydrate in all uppercase letters. 99+% of all of the research, and I'm talking about hundreds of published studies, have been conducted on creatine monohydrate. There is no reason for you to entertain use of a supplement other than creatine monohydrate. All of the safety and efficacy data are on creatine monohydrate. Some of these alternative supplements are nothing more than precursors to creatinine, or they contain very little creatine, and I'm very worried about the content of some of those supplements. We're talking about creatine monohydrate. That's where the research is. Standard supplementation doses. Take 20 grams per day for about 5 days. You'll increase your muscle creatine levels. If you're impatient, you can do the 5-day loading phase. If you're not in a hurry, 3 to 5 grams per day for about a month should do the trick. You've got a ceiling on how much creatine your muscles can hold. Taking 40 grams per day, taking 100 grams per day, there are some bizarre case reports in the literature. None of that works. Some of our old urinary creatine excretion data shows you that even at 20 grams per day for 5 days, you're excreting more than 10 grams per day by day 3 of supplementation. So 20 grams per day should cover most athletes of all sizes. Now, I mentioned that 95% of the creatine is in your skeletal muscles. A small amount is in your brain where it's absolutely critical in energy production. Can you alter the creatine content of your brain? Maybe. How? Maybe with 20 grams per day for 5 days, and maybe this induces about a 10% increase in brain creatine. I say maybe because there's only a small number of labs in the world who have this capability of measuring brain creatine. We have a handful of studies. They don't all conclusively show an increase. For some of them, it's around 3%. Some of them, it's around 5%. The higher end studies are 10%. It does not ever approach the increase in skeletal muscle creatine content that we get with supplementation. And some studies have found no effect. So we need a lot more research in this area, but I want to share that with you because I think it has a lot of value. Now, I think creatine really shines not as a sport performance aid, but as a training aid. This is an old review now. It was a narrative review. What we did was we isolated all of the studies that examined creatine supplementation during resistance training in young, healthy individuals. And we found that in the top graph, if you lift weights, you get stronger. But if you lift weights and take creatine, you get about 8% stronger. That's a substantial gain. What's going on here is probably a spontaneous increase in training volume, that athletes are simply working harder in the weight room, more reps, more sets, probably more weight. One of the only articles was published by Jeff Volek in the late 1990s that actually measured training volume and showed that indeed athletes who ingest creatine, when they go into the weight room, they do more work. In terms of muscular endurance, what we're calling here weightlifting performance, this would be something like a bench press test, 80% of max to fatigue. Lifting weights improves your muscular endurance. Lifting weights while you're taking creatine improves your muscular endurance a lot more than lifting weights while you're taking a placebo. So if you believe that strength and conditioning translates into improved sport performance, then this is a very valuable tool in your toolbox to enhance the output of your strength and conditioning workouts. Now, in terms of performance itself, hundreds of studies have been published, many of them on laboratory performance measures like cycle ergometry, some of them on sport-specific performance measurements. Overall, we could say that creatine supplementation at the doses I've mentioned are effective in improving performance of high-intensity exercise lasting 30 seconds or less, and in particular when there's repeated bouts, which is pretty much a description of weight training. Okay, there are some sports that mirror this description as well. As you would expect with a basic understanding of exercise physiology and nutrition, when you start to go beyond the 30-second mark, there are diminishing returns when we're really relying on carbohydrate metabolism to support performance. There are more than a few studies that show that creatine is effective well beyond the 30-second mark, and I'll explain why I think that is in a moment. I think one thing that's been ignored in the literature is the value of creatine supplementation for endurance athletes who have sprints embedded during or following an endurance exercise challenge. And if you read the small number of studies in this area, they're quite conclusive. If you're sprinting at the end of a cycling endurance race, or if you're having intermittent sprints during the race, possibly a marathon, you'll have a higher power output during those sprints due to your increased muscle creatine levels. So it even has a value for endurance athletes, not just the 30-second or less strength power type of athletes. So that's kind of my creatine monohydrate one-on-one on dosing, training, and as a performance enhancer. I'd like to talk a bit about adaptation, recovery, and then how creatine could possibly enhance the brain. Here's the points I want to touch upon. What are the effects of creatine supplementation on muscle phosphocreatine and glycogen resynthesis? What do we know about what happens in terms of gene expression and growth factor expression? Does creatine have any effect on muscle damage? The media seems convinced that creatine has a bad effect on muscle damage. I would argue it's the opposite. And then what about all of this discussion about creatine increasing your muscle water levels, cellular hyperhydration? So, one by one. When you increase creatine, your muscle phosphocreatine levels increase. That's the biggest effect, in my opinion, that you're putting more fuel in the fuel tank. So you should be able to get an extra repetition or get an extra step on your opponent. However, there's some indication that creatine enhances recovery in that it improves phosphocreatine resynthesis when you're resting in between stressful bouts of exercise. Very few people have the capability of doing this work, so there's only a small number of studies, but it might be the reason that creatine enhances intermittent exercise performance, that it's also enhancing recovery between bouts of exercise. There's also a few studies that have shown that when you load the muscles with creatine, it attracts more carbohydrate into the muscles. A few people have done this purposely and found that carbohydrate loading plus simultaneous creatine loading causes an additional 12% increase in muscle glycogen. This happens mostly in the first 24 hours. So if we try to take a leap to something sport-specific, I would say that creatine monohydrate supplementation can be of benefit to an intermittent athlete who has rest periods between intense bouts of exercise in the order of minutes. Maybe that's gridiron football. And also for athletes who have rest periods in between bouts of intense activity that could be hours or days. which to me is a good description of like a soccer tournament where you're playing 3 games in one day, that something like creatine could possibly help in your recovery in that situation. So I think creatine is a recuperative aid as well as a performance aid in terms of fuel. Now, at a deeper level inside the muscle cell, several years ago, Adil Safdar and Mark Tarnopolsky published an expression on creatine supplementation and gene expression. What they found was that creatine supplementation upregulates about 270 different genes, and some of them are quite relevant to adaptation and recovery. Osmosensing genes, so water balance, cytoskeletal remodeling, glycogen handling, satellite cell proliferation and differentiation, and cell survival. And these are just individuals who were non-exercising, non-training individuals. This was an acute study. They loaded their muscles with creatine and found all of these changes in gene expression. This doesn't surprise me. Whenever you change the energy status of a cell, whether it's on a low carbohydrate diet or carbohydrate cycling or a high carbohydrate diet, it should have some compensatory effects like changes in gene expression. To me, creatine really seems to create an intracellular milieu that is conducive to adaptation from stressful exercise. Now, I'm sorry that Darren Willoughby couldn't be here today. He published 2 fantastic training studies, great basic science combined with great applied science, and showed that when you lift weights and take creatine, you've increased expression of myosin heavy chain, increased myofibrillar protein, increased expression of certain growth factors like myogenin and MERF4. Another study coming at it from a different approach, but the same idea, basic science with applied science, showed improved satellite cell number, improved myofiber area, myonuclei to fiber ratios, or in other words, there's a lot more going on inside the muscle than just extra phosphocreatine. Now, I think creatine is at its best in individuals who are undergoing intense resistance training. It does have effects in those people who aren't training. This paper from Louise Deldique's lab showed increased insulin-like growth factor 1 messenger RNA expression without training, just from creatine-loading individuals. Now, take a breath here. I'm not suggesting that you go home, sit on your couch, take creatine, and you'll grow big muscles. No. I think creatine is also at its best at the extreme ends of the population, right? Those who are physically frail, sarcopenic older adults, those with neuromuscular disease, and possibly those elite athletes who are looking for the smallest gain, then I think this becomes a valuable point. For most of us, I think this is a minor point. We're well-fed, some of us are well-rested, we train hard, and creatine helps us train hard and possibly adapt. Now, final point here about creatine monohydrate. Most of you are familiar with the fact that you take creatine monohydrate and you have an acute increase in body weight. There's no way this is new muscle protein in 3 to 5 days on the order of 4 or 5 or 6 pounds of muscle. This is primarily a shift in fluid and an increase in intracellular water. That's not necessarily a bad thing, okay? I've had an endless number of individuals come up to me and say, it's just water weight. No, that's an oversimplification. That's bro science. In experimental studies, pioneered by Dieter Hausinger, a real expert in protein metabolism, in liver cells, in muscle cells, and in human beings, when they increase intracellular water content, they increase glycogen and protein synthesis, and they decrease protein breakdown. This is not done with creatine supplementation, but with laboratory investigations where they increased intracellular water. So it either doesn't work or it does work with creatine monohydrate. We know it attracts water into the cell. We know it attracts glycogen into the cell. I don't think creatine is just water, and I don't think there is anything bad or dangerous going on here in terms of these fluid shifts, at least no one has presented data to me to indicate that this is a bad thing. It's either a nothing or it's probably something helpful. Now, I want to talk about creatine supplementation and exertional rhabdomyolysis. I had the pleasure of beginning this paper before Priscilla Clarkson passed away, and with Mark Tarnopolsky as a co-author. Memorize that. Big picture here. If I take my pointer and I circle all of the clinical trials of creatine supplementation where they measured indirect markers of exercise-induced muscle damage, all of those studies showed a reduction in the leakage of muscle serum proteins into the bloodstream. They showed reductions in inflammatory cytokines into the bloodstream. We have a few studies that showed enhanced recovery of strength, a study that showed reductions in delayed onset muscle soreness. Now I'm going to take some liberty here because I have the pointer, I can do what I want. These top studies, they were just early creatine studies. They said, we don't know what's going on here. These people are taking creatine. Let's do a blood panel on them and see if anything goes up or down. So there's no exercise intervention in these studies. So from our review article, what you're left with is 12 studies where people were creatine loaded and then subjected to very stressful exercise. All different types. High intensity sprint interval training, a half marathon, a triathlon. In the case of our lab, we did really high force eccentric exercise, which induced profound muscle damage in the biceps. 5 of these studies showed no effect, good or bad. 7 of them showed less damage. If you want to come up here and argue with me that this doesn't indicate less damage, I'll listen to you. I'm not sure which way this is going to go as the next few studies come out, but I have to share with you that there has never been an investigation that showed that creatine-loaded muscles are more susceptible to muscle injury even when subjected to the most barbaric exercise protocols. 12 for 12, no one shows more damage. 7 out of 12, some indicated that there might be less damage, but definitely no damage. So in terms of the muscle injury at the gross level or muscle damage at a more micro level, there's just no evidence to support that. Now, for those of you who deal with injured athletes or possibly patient populations, there's a fair number of research studies on the effects of creatine supplementation following a period of disuse. Most people don't know that your muscle creatine levels decrease with extreme low levels of inactivity like immobilization. Now, I don't know if this actually mimics the decrease in physical activity following a sports injury or a surgery or any sort of medical condition. This is a laboratory-induced scenario with extremely low levels of inactivity, basically zero when you're immobilized. That's one way to decrease muscle creatine levels. If I take the half a dozen creatine supplementation during immobilization studies, every single one of them used different methods, different outcome measures, different time courses, and we can pull out some of the highlights, and it's promising, okay? These studies show that you're better able to maintain your muscle mass or your cross-sectional area when you're ingesting creatine during a period of immobilization. Better maintenance of muscle function, strength, and endurance, better maintenance of muscle creatine, changes in GLUT4 and glycogen levels, and growth factor synthesis. But that's when I paint the picture collectively examining all of the studies together. Luc Van Loon just published a fantastic paper last year where they really didn't find any effect at all. And again, it's very difficult to compare these studies because the methods are so majorly different. But I think this is worth considering for, among other reasons, creatine supplementation could be helping you in other ways. It's widely available, it's relatively inexpensive, and it has a very good safety profile. So there's some things to consider here. Now, a final area of interest is the brain. No disrespect to Holly Holm there, she's one of my favorite fighters. We have a review coming out this year, which I was fortunate enough to co-author with some of my friends from Brazil, Bruno Golano and Amir Dolan. And right now there's 12 creatine supplementation studies where they measured brain creatine. 9 of them show increases in brain creatine. Okay, so we're tipping in favor of we can actually load the brain with creatine And then we can discuss what potential effects there are in a moment. As an example for you of how complicated this is from Bruno Gualano's lab as well. This is, along with some of our pilot data, the only data in the world where there was simultaneous brain and muscle measurements. Very few people can measure muscle creatine. Even fewer people can measure brain creatine. Almost no one can do both. So brain creatine and muscle creatine in the same paper is rare, one paper. Range of responses to creatine supplements in the muscle, 10 to 27%, normal, typical gains. In the brain, from basically 0 to 3%. This is not too far from the retest reliability of brain nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. So that's probably going to be plus or minus 3% as a retest. If the gain is only 3 or 4%, it's going to be very hard to find this without a large number of individuals. And even then, I think we're learning that there's a lot more variability in brain creatine uptake than there is in muscle creatine uptake. Why would I want to increase your brain creatine levels anyway? 2 reasons. Brain creatine is very, very important in terms of energy production in the brain, just like it is in your skeletal muscles. At the moment, there are 13 studies. Remember, hundreds on skeletal muscle, but only about 13 studies on creatine supplementation and cognitive function. 10 of them have showed improved cognitive processing, improved performance of the brain. 3 of them had no effect. I would love to stand here and tell you that these were all done by the same lab and they all used the same methods, but this is not how science progresses. These studies cover old individuals, young individuals, vegetarians, meat eaters, well-rested individuals, as well as stressed individuals, stressed with sleep deprivation or sleep deprivation plus exercise or some sort of frustrating and aggravating mental task like doing mathematics backwards. Okay? The dosing is different. The duration of the studies is different. With all that noise, we still get 10 out of 13 to show improved cognitive processing. Again, inexpensive, widely available, you might be worth it for the muscle function gains. Maybe we should be thinking about this in a really broad context in terms of brain health. There's a lot more work to do in this area. Now, I think we need to talk a little bit about concussion. So let's start here. He's okay. Here, watch this one. When I watch this one, I see a helmet-to-head injury, a whiplash injury, and a head-to-ground injury. 1, 2, 3. Now, I really want to say go Patriots, but I know that's classless, so I'll just kind of think it. I don't want to be, sexist or just pick on football, so let's look at soccer, shall we? Oh. I think she hurt her knee. There's a lot of people interested in concussion and if we can have any effect nutritionally. If you haven't read the 2016 outcomes paper from the Berlin Conference on Concussion, if this is your area of interest, you should read that paper. There are a lot of narrative reviews and theoretical reviews on whether or not we can intervene and have any effect on concussion nutritionally. Creatine has been the focus of some of these discussions. I won't say it's ready for prime time. I'm going to post this metabolic pathway. You can jot down the reference from Dean and colleagues in 2017. You're not meant to memorize this, but what I'd like you to do is look for red. Everywhere this is the neurometabolic cascade. This is what's bad going on in your head after concussion, which is a lot. Everywhere you see red, reactive oxygen species, oxidative respiration, calcium handling, glycolysis, lactic acid, membrane repolarization, these are all areas that creatine can benefit. So we don't really have any other tricks up our sleeve beyond creatine and possibly some preliminary stuff on omega fats. It looks like creatine can possibly benefit traumatic brain injury. Now, what evidence do I have to support that? It's largely circumstantial, but I think it's worth sharing. We know that creatine is neuroprotective. We've been studying creatine as a neuroprotective for a long time. Most people don't know that your brain creatine levels actually decrease with mild traumatic brain injury. There's a period of a hypoenergetic state, and one of the things that decreases is your brain creatine levels. Now, how do we measure a reduction in the severity of concussion when we feed people creatine? It's difficult, right? It's been addressed in an animal model, and typically with all of this wonderful human data, I don't even mention an animal model, but today I'll share with you one. You want to see what it looks like to damage an animal? Right. We're going to go with that picture. A traumatic brain injury in animals is just what it sounds like. Okay? It's just like what happens in sports. A traumatic brain injury in a laboratory animal. When you creatine supplement the animal, you get as much as a 50% reduction in structural damage. It's an animal. It's not a human model. It might not work at all in humans, but I think that's important to share. When they do a hypoxic challenge in animals, which sounds just as awful as you would imagine, there's less damage in the creatine supplemented animals. Now, there's a hypoxic model in humans. There's only one lab in the world that does this. They're in New Zealand. They have people breathe oxygen-deprived air, and the cognitive dysfunction that it induces mirrors the cognitive dysfunction you get from a concussion. Creatine supplementation attenuates that cognitive disruption. They've moved into concussion research, but we don't have the data yet to share. There are 2 papers on traumatic brain injury in children. This comes from the clinical world. We don't know much about these patients. They had brain injuries. They're in hospitals. This is an open-label study. When I give children creatine who have traumatic brain injuries, all of the symptoms associated with that brain injury, headache, dizziness, fatigue, they're reduced in those who are fed creatine. So we have a small amount of human data, but an open-label clinical study is different from a laboratory clinical trial with all the controls. And also what I've mentioned, we think we can increase muscle-brain creatine level, and we think it improves cognitive processing, and we're up to about a dozen studies or so, but I know more are in the pipeline. Now, one of the reasons that I'm hesitant to flat out say creatine in the brain works just as well as creatine in the muscle is because of our own data, and apologies for the unpublished pilot data. I promise I'll get to them eventually. The bar represents average increase in muscle total creatine, and the circles represent individual changes. So some people had a low response, some people had a medium response, some people had a higher response, but everyone who ingested creatine had an increase in muscle creatine. When we flipped them around and put their head in the magnet, on average, there was about a 2.5% increase in brain creatine, but of course it wasn't statistically significant because look at the variability. Some people had remarkably large increases and other people had remarkably large decreases. What we're missing from this body of literature are all the dose response studies, all of the studies on regional specific differences in the brain. We only have a few labs who are capable of doing this work and only a handful of studies that have even attempted to answer some of these questions. So we know that the brain is more protective of things entering than the muscle, right? This separation of creatine synthesis from creatine utilization in the body, it's made outside of the muscle, so the muscles are really primed to absorb and take up creatine. The brain has its own metabolic machinery to synthesize creatine. It might not want creatine coming in from the outside, or at least it might fight against it. So we need some serial measurements, we need dose response studies, we need a lot more work in this area so we can figure out what the dose is and can we actually modify brain creatine nutritionally, because I think the stakes are pretty high here, especially in the world of concussion. Now, briefly, just 2 slides. We don't have the time today, but I'm happy to answer any questions. A lot of work has been done in creatine supplementation in sarcopenic older adults. Two excellent reviews for you, the one from Stu Phillips and his student, and the one from Darren Kandow, where they collapsed all of the individual research studies of creatine supplementation in older adults, and they found that creatine supplementation increases fat-free mass, it increases strength, it even increases function as measured by a 30-second chair stand test. So again, an inexpensive, widely available nutritional aid with an excellent safety profile can improve the quality of life in older adults. In terms of patient populations, it's much more complicated because the pathologies are so different. This figure is from one of our review articles from a few years ago, and in the green you're looking at a number of diseases where creatine supplementation has been shown to be effective. These are genetic disorders, heart failure patients receive benefit, sarcopenic older adults, a lot of the muscular dystrophy studies, and then it gets a little noisy with some of the mitochondrial diseases and fibromyalgia, some of the drug addiction studies. I would like to take depression out of the yellow pie and move it into the green slice because I think some of the creatine depression studies are very, very compelling. And then with some of these pathologies, it's just not going to work. Now, if you have some free time, every 5 years or so, if you can imagine how nerdy is this, that a group of us gather somewhere in the world and talk about creatine and nothing but creatine for an entire week. For the practitioner, when the next creatine conference happens, we publish the outcomes of the study. All of us are required to write conference proceeding papers. So you get about 10 creatine supplementation papers. One might do brain, one might do aging, one person might do neuromuscular diseases and so forth. And this is the most up-to-date information because we turn it over very fast after the conference. So next one will probably be in 2020. You can all come. All right, so I hope I've convinced you that creatine has some very beneficial effects, but possibly not enough to beat an army of aliens with Loki at the helm. What I want you to leave here with is a few simple points. Creatine is way more than the creatine kinase reaction. Okay? This is a pleiotropic nutrient that has effects across several tissues and has several important actions. I want you to leave here knowing that creatine supplementation has been shown to be effective in the performance of brief, intense exercise, both by increasing muscle phosphorylcreatine prior to exercise and also probably by enhancing resynthesis of glycogen and phosphorylcreatine in between bouts of exercise. I'd like you to know that creatine is probably helpful in adaptation, but there's a lot more work to be done. It definitely turns on several pathways, activates gene expression in several important areas. The cell swelling is interesting. The reductions in muscle damage have potential, but there's a lot more work to do in this area. At the very least, I don't have any evidence to share with you that it's doing harm. Creatine likely improves cognitive processing and brain energetics. The effects on skill performance, like what an athlete would do, throwing a football accurately, shooting a basketball accurately, we don't have that information yet. These are laboratory, computer-based reaction time, cognitive function type tests. The mild traumatic brain injury data are very interesting, but the data are lacking at this time. And then if I could just take a moment, thank my UMass mentor, Priscilla Clarkson, Janet, hi, and Dino, the executive committee, the board at New England ACSM. It's always my pleasure to be here. Too many colleagues and students to count. My co-presenters, this crew, my older sister, twin sister, son, and Auntie Stella. Doctors Miles, Persky, Rhodey, Volpe, and Hubel. These are all New England ACSM alumni and continue to be my source of inspiration. Thank you for your attention.